I would like to welcome Kathleen Davis from the Clooney Foundation of Justice. Kathleen is the Director of Strategic Engagement for the Waging Justice for Women initiative. Prior to joining the Clooney Foundation for Justice, Kathleen served as the Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, where her work included promoting human rights and gender equality through the development and implementation of Canada's feminist foreign and international assistance policies. Kathleen has worked in various capacities in the field of international human rights, including at the UN Women, the International Criminal Court, and the Special Tribune for Lebanon and the Human Rights Watch. So Kathleen, thank you so much for joining us today. I want to just take a moment and thank our sponsors, the Arthur M. Blank Foundation, the Longview Foundation, and the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, along with the High Stakes Foundation. So thank you to our sponsors, and really thank you for joining us. Welcome to Montana. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And I heard you're having quite the snow day there, so I'm sure we might have less people than we might otherwise have. But hi to everyone, both live and later on recording. Had the pleasure of going to Montana a few years ago. I was in Whitefish, and it was beautiful. So I love your state. And yeah, just a little bit about me. I'm from Canada, so in terms of weather, I'm very familiar with very snowy days. I live sort of near Ottawa on the Quebec side where they speak French. The reason I'm here is when I worked for the Prime Minister, I had to be based in Ottawa. So I sort of settled here about 5-6 years ago. But before that, my career has taken me sort of all over the world. I lived in New York and I lived in London and I traveled kind of extensively. I lived in The Hague for a little while. So I've, really enjoyed those aspects of my career. And, one of the messages I'll sort of share throughout is just, I would encourage you, you're obviously coming from such a beautiful place, so it'd be understandable if you never want to leave Montana, but I would encourage you to sort of think about ways you can kind of expand your own horizons and travel and get experiences abroad and, diversify sort of your worldview so that you can get involved in the world in various ways. You might end up coming home like I did, but, spending time abroad and sort of traveling is such a passion of mine. And just in terms of career, I'm obviously here to speak. The reason I was asked was as a human rights lawyer. So I've sort of focused a lot of my remarks on that, but I have worked in politics, as Ali mentioned. I've also worked in media for a short time at CNN National in London. And I've sort of let myself not be sort of limited in that sense to one lane. And so that's another of the messages that I would just say off the top is, I think there's young people like yourselves are under a lot of pressure often to sort of so early declare a major and, kind of try to put your fate in a very clear box. And I would encourage you to just not be afraid to sort of follow your heart and, experiment a bit throughout your career and take on new challenges that might be a little bit outside your comfort zone. And I've done that and I've really enjoyed it. And I think at the end of the day, it's led for me to have sort of a diverse skill set that's been valued by and given me some really cool jobs now that I get to combine some of those skills that I learned in media and politics and law. So don't be afraid to kind of jump ship and go in a different direction if your heart tells you to. So.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. Now, I think we have a video. Would you like me to go ahead and share that as an introduction to the Clooney Foundation for
Yes,
Justice?
that would be great. So that's sort of very pertinent to the work I'm doing now. So right now, as Ali said, I work for the Clooney Foundation for Justice. And so this video is just a, fairly short video about our work. And it sort of outlines the 3 initiatives that we have and the work that we're doing and why our co-founders, George and Amal Clooney, why they set it up.
Okay, so here we go. Let's make sure everybody can see that. And if you can't hear it, alert me immediately. Oh dear, what's going on?
It has been the most turbulent year in a decade. Tensions in Thailand have boiled over.
The verdict today sends a very dangerous message.
These were not acts of war. These were war crimes.
It's never been more dangerous to report the news.
Right now, we've had it, and we want to get at least somebody in there to protect these people so that if you've been lucky enough to survive, you should at least have the right to live.
The Clooney Foundation for Justice provides free legal support to victims of human rights abuses all over the world. We now operate in over 40 countries, and our aim is always the same: to protect the persecuted and to try to prosecute the perpetrators.
We believe in a world where human rights are valued, journalists are protected, and brutal dictators, no matter how powerful, stand trial for their crimes.
The first thing that I found so impressive about George and Amal was the vision that they had to address what is clearly one of the world's pressing problems. When people's freedom is at stake, that the need for justice is the most paramount.
Each of our key programs aims to fight systemic injustice.
Today, we're actively investigating war crimes, we're monitoring sham trials targeting women and journalists, and we're fighting against a global trend of authoritarianism that seeks to punish those who challenge power. I am ashamed as a supporter of the United Nations that states are failing to prevent or even punish genocide because they find that their own interests get in the way.
We demand justice for survivors of mass atrocities, and far too often, women are the targets of these crimes. In a landmark case, Amal represented Yazidi survivors in the first ever conviction of an ISIS member for genocide.
شكراً للصديقة المحامية أمل كلوني وفريقها الذين يبذلون جهود كبيرة في محاسبة داعش.
Ukraine is today a slaughterhouse. I believe we got here by ignoring justice for so long.
Over the last year, the docket has filed 5 cases in European countries and with the UN against Russian military commanders for the crimes committed in Ukraine.
For me, the Clooney Foundation for Justice is the inspiration that justice will prevail, and I think that many Ukrainians think the same.
En Venezuela hay más de 334 casos de asesinato por persecución política en mi país. Con el apoyo de la Fundación Clooney para la Justicia, hemos podido hacer un trabajo que nos acerca más a la justicia a favor de las víctimas en Venezuela.
The people of Darfur, who I tried to defend for 17 years, they finally get to see one of their attackers in The Hague. Amal, along with a team of lawyers from the Clooney Foundation, represented over 100 victims in the trial, and is now working with the International Criminal Court to bring other Sudanese war criminals to justice.
Our case against Congolese warlord Roger Lumbala marks the first criminal trial of a leader accused of rape, murder, and cannibalism during a deadly civil war in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we're not only helping survivors of war. Our work aims to safeguard and empower the rights of women and girls all over the globe.
The core mission of Waging Justice for Women is to promote, protect, and defend the rights of women and girls wherever they are.
In only 3 years, we've provided legal representation in 100 cases in courts across Africa and given free legal advice to more than 1,000 women and girls.
This past year, I traveled to Malawi with the former First Lady of the United States, Michelle Obama, and global philanthropist Melinda Gates, to work towards ending child marriage in the region. We want to help to make child marriage history so that every girl can choose the life that she wants.
CFJ has helped us in remote communities. Most of these women don't know about the law, so we're going there to make sure that even they are able to know their rights and they're able to enforce them.
Our fellowship program is now off the ground, promoting young women in the law, and we're looking forward to welcoming our new cohort of next generation leaders in January.
With the support of the Clooney Foundation for Justice, I am forever a wager of justice for women.
In our work, we're not only promoting accountability against those who commit violence or discrimination, we're also trying to protect those who report on it. This is what the Clooney Foundation's Trial Watch program seeks to address. The verdict today sends a very dangerous message in Egypt. It sends a message that journalists can be locked up for simply doing their job, for telling the truth and reporting the news. We expose this injustice by placing trial monitors in courtrooms, identifying sham trials, and representing those who are unfairly imprisoned.
Through our Trial Watch program, dozens of clients have already been acquitted or freed.
When an international organization like CFJ raised concerns about judicial system and fair trial rights in Thailand, that makes a lot of impact.
I think it's very important now to have someone with Amal Clooney's credibility to be out there saying, this is a really important issue that the world needs to be paying attention to.
This year, we've seen women particularly targeted through the courts. Through our program, we fought for their release.
Trial Watch jugó un papel clave en la decisión del juez. Yo siento que era un triunfo de las mujeres periodistas en este país, tan venidas, tan agobiadas, acosadas.
In the age of lawfare, you need lawyers like Amal who understand the legal system, not just of individual countries, but what is available globally.
Without Trial Watch, I don't think I'll be seeing my father today. And I'm telling you that with deep, 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 deep sincerity.
The reality is we fail much more often than we succeed. And for many of the causes we take on, it can be years before we see a clear path to justice. But every time a journalist is freed or a victim gets their day in court, it's a victory. It's a victory for them, their families, and for justice.
The people we work to protect are journalists and freedom fighters from around the world who have sacrificed so much in the pursuit of justice. Their spirit, their courage, and their strength reminds us of who we are at our best. It's not easy, it never has been, but we are fighting for the world we want to leave to our children and to yours. A world at its best. So we choose to wage justice, and we hope that you'll join us to do the same.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So yeah, that just provides a brief, or not so brief, but overview of CFJ. And I don't know if anyone had questions based on that, or Ali, if you did, if you wanted to lead off.
Absolutely. I'm definitely going to leave it off. So Kathleen, will you tell us a little bit about your role in the organization? You said you're a human rights lawyer. Tell us a little bit more about that. And is that what you predominantly do with the Clooney Foundation for Justice?
Yeah, exactly. Well, so I've recently taken on a new role with CFJ. For the first 3 years that I was with CFJ, I helped build their women's rights program called Waging Justice for Women. They didn't have any women's rights division when I joined, so I was very privileged in getting to sort of help build that from the ground up. And so that was very exciting. We were able to sort of set a strategic vision. We did a ton of consultations with women from all over the world about sort of what we should prioritize. We ended up picking 5 sort of target areas to work on: child marriage, gender-based violence, access to schools, economic discrimination against women and girls, and then what's called morality crimes, where women and girls are targeted for prosecution just based on sort of old ideas of what morality is, like what they wear or things like that. So we have these sort of 5 issue areas. So for 3 years, I helped build a team. We now have about a dozen lawyers working on various cases. Right now, they're focused in Africa because there was both a huge demand for the work, but also not a lot of investment from other organizations. But they hope to expand to Asia next, and eventually to Latin America as well, sort of creating a global network of lawyers working on these issues for women all across the global South. So that was very exciting, and I learned a lot. And then George and Amal have recently asked me to become the Director of Strategic Partnerships across CFJ to help them sort of build out the foundation more broadly, do some fundraising, but also sort of set the strategic direction and help kind of raise our profile and create partnerships with other great organizations. You saw there that we work with the Gates Foundation, for example, the Obama Foundation. We work with lots of other grassroots partners all over the world. So I'm sort of helping to lead that charge and to sort of grow the organization as a whole.
Oh, that's excellent. I imagine that you are a very busy, very busy woman. Um,
Yes.
what are some of the key challenges that human rights lawyers face when advocating for marginalized groups?
So there are a lot, as you might imagine, and that video sort of shows well. It can be risky work. It's most risky for our clients usually, but lawyers themselves, especially local counsel that we work with, are often targeted as well for sort of cracking down. So in places around the world where governments are, looking to limit the human rights of various groups, their lawyers often become the target as well. So we sometimes have been representing clients and then end up having to represent their lawyers as well, who also get swept up in sort of cracking down. And so there's this obvious challenge of just, speaking truth to justice and sort of, fighting against sort of authoritarianism and other forms of sort of government crackdowns. And then there's also sort of the work itself. It takes an emotional toll. And so, I always encourage my colleagues and anyone I work with, the work we do can be very challenging. And some of the victims or sort of survivors that we work with have been through a lot. And so you have to sort of find ways to balance those challenges as well as an individual.
I can imagine. We have a question from Thompson Falls. They asked, what inspired you to go into this profession, and what cases are you proudest that you were part of?
Ooh, that's a great question. So I've always been a bit of a bleeding heart, and I don't know if there's anyone else out there who can kind of relate to that. But from a very early age, I was sort of fascinated by various global events. One of them, for example, that was very formative for me was learning about apartheid in South Africa. It was I am a lot older than all of you. I'm not that old, but it was sort of before my time. But it was Nelson Mandela was freed when I was a very young girl, and then his first foreign trip, he actually came to Canada to support the cause of sort of working against apartheid and freeing him and the country from sort of that terrible legacy. And so he came and they had a big gathering. He said he wanted to speak to kids because he wanted to sort of give hope to kids. So at the age of, I think I was 11, I was able to apply through the speech competition, and I got to represent my school and go to the Sky Dome where the Toronto Blue Jays play. And I was one of like 40,000 kids or something. It was a lot of people. But I got to hear Nelson Mandela speak of sort of his hope for South Africa and the world. And it was a very formative experience. And so that was one of the early reasons I sort of got interested. And then, I was lucky to have a lot of mentors along the way, one of whom is now Amal, but lots of who had sort of followed this path of fighting for justice and becoming a lawyer to do the right thing and to try to help people in need. So that was one of the earliest inspirations. Yeah.
That's great. And so the second part of that question was, are there a few cases that you're particularly proud of that you were involved with?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I can speak to many that I've been involved with, including, I would say one that was very early in my career. So I played a fairly small role, but when I was an articling student, which in Canada, that's your first year of practicing law, I was able to help on this case that was originally called the 160 Girls Project. But what it was there were a group of girls that swelled to hundreds and hundreds of girls who in Kenya, they had just in 2010 started their own constitution, a new constitution that enshrined greater human rights for everyone. And the young girls took on the police because there were all these instances where the police, even though they would hear reports of violence against girls and all sorts of violence, including sexual violence and other things, they wouldn't do anything. There was sort of a corrupt sort of legacy of the police just not acting on these cases. And so this group of girls, with the help of some lawyers, took this on. And so it was girls as young as 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and up. And they took on this case that ultimately went all the way up to the highest court in Kenya. And they were able to get a judgment that said that the police weren't doing their jobs and that they had failed in their responsibility to these girls. And so it was the first ever ruling under the new constitution of Kenya was by these young girls to kind of uphold the law in that way. And so I've been lucky to now be part of other cases like that or know of other cases like that. And I think what inspired me most was, these girls had been through the ringer and, had really suffered so much, but they had so much hope and so much determination. And so if, 6-year-olds can take on a government like that, I think it really is something that's inspiring for all of us to think of, what we could be a part of in that way.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. And to have that experience in one of the first years out of law school, that must have been very powerful.
Definitely. Yeah, it's definitely shaped sort of where I ended up. And now I'm happy that team that I built of a dozen lawyers, that's the kind of case that they're working on. So it's an exciting thing to see kind of full circle.
We have a question from Gardner. Where in the world, do you feel that there is the most hope for change?
Ooh. Well, I'll stick on that theme. I think in Africa, and I mean, I'm partly biased because that's where I've been doing the most work over the last 3 years, but there are so many instances like that and in particular, and I mean, it was because I was focused on this, but young girls and women in particular are just really setting these amazing precedents all across Africa. And so, for example, there was a group of girls in Sierra Leone who about almost 10 years ago started a case that about 5 years ago wrapped up. And it was called the Waves case, but it was about, there was a ban at the time against pregnant girls who wanted to go to school, and they would get kicked out of school when they became pregnant and then often not allowed back in. And so it was obviously limiting their potential and their, futures so much. So these girls got together and they took that case to the ECOWAS court, which is a regional court in Africa. And the ECOWAS court ruled against Sierra Leone and said that this was violating the human rights of these girls. And so that they ordered the government to change their laws. And the government then not only just repealed this ban, but they also then kind of had a sort of, there was a change in government, and this new young minister of education took this very drastic change where he adopted a policy called radical inclusion. And it was with the help of all the girls feeding in and all these activists. And essentially now Sierra Leone leads Africa in terms of the policies it has to ensure that women, young women who are menstruating can still go to school. Young mothers can go to school. There's childcare. There's all sorts of ways that they're now accommodating young women to, be able to pursue their education. And so that inspired a spate of other cases, one of which we were part of, my team, where in Tanzania, they took on a similar ban and they had that overturned. And another young woman we work with in Tanzania took on there was a law that permitted child marriage, and she took that on and had that changed. So, it's this incredibly hopeful situation where very young women with very little power vis-a-vis the state have worked with lawyers to kind of get these incredibly exciting judgments. And, there's a long road, like in that case in Tanzania of the child marriage repeal. The highest court in the land said the child marriage laws are unconstitutional and overturned them. The government hasn't yet acted to provide new laws that end child marriage. And so there's a long road of sort of, Rebecca Guillaume was the girl who challenged the law. And so we still work with her, and we're trying to push the government to do the right thing and put in place better laws. So it's not an immediate overnight solution, but I think it's just very exciting to see these sort of young people like yourselves taking on powerful kind of forces and really creating change.
That's incredible. Which country has the most problems that the foundation operates in?
Whew, I mean, it's hard to pick just one. I would say, there are some countries that are so challenging that we're not even able to work in. So, there are some countries like Iran, for example, that we have broadly spoken about the issues at play, but it's just so dangerous to operate as a human rights organization there that we've had to sort of do quiet work in and around the margins. But it's almost impossible to work there. And similarly, places like China, it's completely inaccessible to those, some of our work, for example, involves monitoring trials. So we'll send in trial monitors to sort of be the eyes and ears of the world in the courtrooms where journalists or protesters are being charged with things. But in places like China or Iran, there's no access. And even if you try to sort of show up to a courtroom or something, you could get arrested at the gates, sort of thing. So I'd say those are the worst cases. We have other cases that are very challenging. For example, in Venezuela or Ukraine, we have a team in each of those countries and clients who are living in country and facing a lot of physical threats for speaking out, or, in Venezuela, for example, speaking out against the Maduro government, and he's still in power. And so, those are very challenging just because you fear for the safety of your clients as well.
Absolutely. So, I think what I would like to have is a little introduction into the hierarchy of law, because it sounds like you play on a lot of different levels, from the international to the very local. Would you give us like the 101 law hierarchy for international law, or for what the foundation works on, just briefly?
Definitely. No, and it is complicated, so I don't blame anyone who has trouble following. So essentially, from the very, I'll go sort of from the bottom up. So from the very local, for example, we'll help support local administration of justice. So in Malawi, for example, we're doing work to support grassroots women lawyers who go into tiny communities that are very remote, who have no other access, like often no internet access and things. And they'll go do legal clinics where they'll set up sort of a tent essentially, and they'll have a sort of information session outlining the basic laws around certain pertinent issues like child marriage or gender-based violence or whatever they might be. And then after the group session, and it's open to anyone, they then have private one-on-one kind of sessions where lawyers provide free legal advice at that level to women and girls. And so, you might have questions ranging everything from child marriage and gender-based violence to sort of custody rights and property rights. If someone just got divorced, they want to know their rights around their children and their property and things like that. And so these lawyers, with no payment made by the people concerned, we support them, and we've bought, vehicles for them and other sort of supports to have them be able to go and access all of these remote communities and provide very localized sort of knowledge of their legal rights. And the hope is that, on one level, you're just educating whole communities, including, Amal joined one of our legal clinics on child marriage in this small place called Mchinji, and when she visited Malawi, and there were like over 1,000 people turned up, and lots of men and women and others. And then at the end, we had women come kind of be pulled aside, and they were provided legal advice. So the goal is sort of multifaceted. It's like broad awareness of the laws, specific legal advice, and then the odd time these lawyers will be able to take on one of those cases and maybe move it up the local justice system. So to compare it to the US, you would be able to take on a case in Montana. Maybe that would ultimately go to the Supreme Court of the US if the question was sort of legally relevant on a national scale. And then you have, at times, you can appeal to a regional body. So if, for example, then you get to the Supreme Court of Malawi and the question hasn't been sufficiently dealt with in your mind, you can actually take that to the African Court of Human and People's Rights. And that, on a regional level, they will issue a verdict, and they could actually order Malawi, for example, to change its laws in a certain case. And so that case in Tanzania I referenced on the pregnancy ban, that's what we did. And so the African court ruled against Tanzania in that case. And then at the international level, you have various organs of justice, and I won't get into all the details because I will have everyone asleep by the end, but essentially there are the International Court of Justice, there's the International Criminal Court you may have heard of, and then there's other UN bodies like the Human Rights Committee and others. So there, sometimes you can go direct, sometimes you have to work your way through those sort of regional and national bodies, but you can go and get a ruling at the highest kind of levels that says that your country has failed to implement a law in the right way, or one of its laws are discriminatory. Does that
Wow,
make
thank
sense?
you. Yeah, that's wonderful. And it sounds like so just for you and for the students, when you focused in on this work, did you have to become familiar with international law, with laws of specific countries? What did that look like for you personally?
Yeah, it's a kind of never-ending learning journey, honestly. So I did a lot of education in international law itself, and I've done various, when I was in law school, I really worked kind of in line with what I was saying off the top, where I was very motivated to sort of go out and get experiences abroad. And so I did a series of internships and fellowships and different sort of learning experiences at the International Criminal Court and the Special Tribunal for Lebanon and the ICTY and others, the Yugoslav Tribunal. And so there I sort of would focus in on, various elements of international law and how that sort of worked vis-a-vis sort of, both individual rights, but also sort of your rights vis-a-vis your state. And so I didn't necessarily have specialization in Malawian law or anything to start. And then as you go, you work with local council. So we have like excellent council in Malawi who would sort of educate us and, where it made sense, there's sort of a happy marriage between the local expertise that our Malawian council provide and our expertise, for example, Amal's very, very well-honed expertise in international law, so that where a case rises to the level of going beyond Malawi's courts, we can provide that broader knowledge to support the Malawian lawyers in taking a case that far, because, there's a lot of complexity in doing that. So we very much work with local council wherever we are, because they know best what laws are applicable and what strategies will work in their own contexts. But we provide that sort of broader context where sometimes a national court will be persuaded by what another national court has said. So I'm from Canada. In South Africa, for example, like when they first created their constitution, they based it a lot on the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. Same, the Kenyan Constitution I referenced, that was often based on the Canadian example, just because it was a very comprehensive human rights sort of constitution. So there is a bit of sort of, you can teach one another about your systems of law.
That's great. So you mentioned that the organization works with the United Nations. How do you do that, and what does that work look like? And how do you use that work to address those global issues?
Yeah. So again, if the international court system is complex, the UN system is even more complex. So it's, like alphabet soup, right? You have UN, all sorts of bodies. But what I'd say is we sort of work with the UN on two levels. On one level, we are collaborators with UN workers. So for example, in various places we work, the UN representatives there are often working for similar reasons. So, we've done work in Sudan. And so if anyone hasn't followed, there's been a war in Sudan where a lot of human rights have been undermined. So there are representatives from the UN and the International Criminal Court and others who are there investigating very similar cases to what we are. So in those instances, you'll work together, the same in Ukraine or in Venezuela. And so we'll often work together as collaborators to sort of share information. Sometimes we formally join a case at the International Criminal Court or something similar to that. But also the UN, certain of the UN bodies are actually more like a court where they're sort of adjudicative. And so we'll, in those instances, take a case all the way to, let's say, the Human Rights Committee or the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention or a body like that. And in that case, we're not collaborating so much as we're presenting facts to a body, and they issue a ruling whether, the individual who we're representing's rights have been violated or not.
Absolutely. So how can high school students get involved in human rights and gender equality causes?
Well, I think it's a great question, and it's one that I'm sort of passionate about, in the sense, what I find is law, generally speaking, seems very inaccessible to people. And I find, at a dinner party or wherever I am, I find a lot of people will go, oh, well, I don't know anything about that. It's like, I'm sure similar to being a doctor where people assume you have knowledge that is beyond what they could imagine. And it's sort of, there's a bit of mysticism around law. I think partially it's because we still speak Latin in some of the cases and stuff, and, self-preservation. But what I like to sort of try to demystify is, in every case I've cited today and in every case I've ever been part of, some of the most important players are not the lawyers. It's the people who are sort of either taking on the cases, so sort of the plaintiffs, if you will, or the claimants in the case. And also, in order for law to mean anything, you often have to work with a broad array of sort of a movement around these cases. So all of those cases I cited in Africa, for example, if you only got the legal ruling, it's really just a piece of paper. It doesn't mean very much. But it was all those girls and high school students like yourselves who wrote the Minister of Education and, protested and went out on the streets and, got active. And so I think, I always encourage people to see law as just one of the tools in sort of the activist toolbox. And that, it's not something that anyone should be afraid to sort of try to use, and that even just the assertion that you have human rights that are enshrined in law is a valuable tool to use. So, I think as high school students, even if you're not pursuing a legal case or anything like that, you can sort of get active about issues that you care about and where you think that someone's human rights are not being upheld. You could write your member of Congress, or you could, tweet about it, or you could just get active in one way or another. And then, on a very localized level, I think that, the sort of real work of human rights really comes down to sort of allyship and people sticking up for one another. And so, just even within your high schools, if you ever see someone being, discriminated against, or, if there's a bully and they're kind of using bigoted sort of terms and other things, I think, acting as an individual to uphold those basic ideas of human rights is a real contribution. So if you can even do that, just sticking up for people and being inclusive and sort of doing that on a very localized scale, if you add that all up, we'd have a much better world. So
that's great. So Gardner is curious, how many people work for the Clooney Foundation?
So there are about 45 people, some of whom are permanent staff, some of whom are consultants. And we do take on a lot of interns and fellows. So interns usually being either undergraduate or law students, and then fellows often being either just graduated law students or law graduate students, like LLM students. So a little bit beyond high school. I don't know if we've ever had a high school intern, but we do have sort of a surrounding cadre of people who help the work that aren't on staff as well.
That's wonderful. Okay, and my final question for you today, Kathleen, is what advice would you give to students who are passionate about human rights and are interested in pursuing a career, maybe in law or in the pursuit of helping with human rights?
I would say do it. And I'll kind of, maybe kind of end off where I led off a little bit, just to kind of bookend it, is, for me, I was always just sort of passionate about this stuff. And, despite sort of no one necessarily leading me towards it, I was from this small town in Ontario. Like, it's not like I had ready access to sort of lawyers who worked in The Hague or in New York or anything like that. And so don't let either the remote nature of it or sort of in some ways the prestige of it, if there is any, get in your way. Like if this is something you're interested in, you might have to do what I did, where you have to hustle pretty hard. And like, I was always applying for scholarships and bursaries and, rubbing pennies together because it doesn't pay a lot at first. And so, there are challenges, but don't think, well, I'm from Whitefish, Montana, or wherever you are, and I am too removed from it all to get involved, because that's just not true. I've sort of proven that you can do it from small town Ontario. And then I would say also that let your heart guide you, and let it evolve where, when I was first sort of in undergrad, I got daunted by the idea that I had to choose. I had a huge interest in law and I ended up pursuing that. But I also had a huge interest in journalism and sort of like reporting on current events. And ultimately, throughout my career, I sort of unhinged myself from this need to be one thing and from labels. And I ended up doing, I was also interested in politics and I ended up kind of doing all of those things. And, it took a real hustling mentality and you've got to be okay with rejection along the way. But I didn't let myself kind of get defined by any one thing. And in the end, I've had like, in my own view, because it's been my own, heart I've been following, I've had such a fascinating and just really fulfilling career. And wherever I've noticed that I'm not doing something that aligns well with either my skill set or my values or anything, I very quickly just pivoted and moved on from that. So don't be afraid. Like, I think there's too much pressure on you guys, as I said off the top, to declare a major and then stick with it and, find a job that's going to, be a 10-year plan or something. And I just wouldn't see it like that. I would just, just really enjoy the process and the journey and let yourself not look too far ahead. And for me, I don't look back and have any regrets. So I think you wouldn't either if you followed that kind of advice.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk with you today, Kathleen. And thank you from all of our students in Montana as well. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
You too, and stay warm and safe and get cozy tonight, everyone.
That sounds great. Okay, thanks so much. Goodbye.
Take care. Bye.